Every morning, millions of people wake up, shuffle to the kitchen, pour themselves a cup of coffee, and feel quietly guilty about it. They have been told it is not ideal, too much caffeine, hard on the stomach, maybe bad for the heart, so they drink it anyway because the alternative is worse, and then they spend the rest of the morning loading their body with a bowl of something sweet, processed, and convenient that they have been told is healthy because it says so on the box. They have tried cutting out coffee. They felt worse. They have tried the expensive supplements advertised for inflammation. Nothing changed. They went to a doctor and heard the same sentence they always hear: eat less, move more, reduce stress, and then they drove home, made another cup of coffee, and felt guilty again. I am here to tell you that the guilt is misplaced and the supplements are unnecessary. Coffee is not your enemy. Oats, real oats, not the flavored packets, are not just fiber. They are pharmaceutical-grade anti-inflammatory compounds sitting in your pantry, probably right now. And the reason nobody has told you this clearly is that there is no revenue in telling you to drink something that costs cents a cup and eat something that costs pennies a bowl. That changes today. Subscribe and hit like right now. We are pushing toward 100,000 subscribers, and this channel cannot grow without you. Here's something worth knowing before we go any further. The healthcare system is not built to keep you well. It is built to keep you coming back. There is no billing code for the conversation we are about to have. The one about the two things already in your kitchen that can begin reducing systemic inflammation today at zero additional cost. What you are about to hear, nobody at your next appointment is going to volunteer. So subscribe, hit like, and let's get into it. Let's start with what is actually happening inside your body when chronic inflammation takes hold, because most people have no accurate picture of this. And without the picture, the solutions make no sense. Inflammation is not a disease. It is a process, and in the short term, it is one of the most important processes your body runs. When you cut your finger, when you catch a virus, when you strain a muscle, the inflammatory response floods the area with immune cells, accelerates blood flow, and begins repair. That is inflammation doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem is not inflammation. The problem is inflammation that never switches off. In a healthy body, the inflammatory response activates, does its job, and down regulates. It turns itself down. The mechanism that governs this is called cytokine signaling. Cytokines are small proteins released by immune cells, essentially chemical messengers that regulate the intensity and duration of the inflammatory response. There are pro-inflammatory cytokines that fire up the response and anti-inflammatory cytokines that dampen it back down. In a well-regulated system, they balance each other, activate, resolve, return to baseline. Here's what changes. Under the influence of poor diet, chronic sleep disruption, sedentary habits, and persistent metabolic stress, the anti-inflammatory arm of that signaling system becomes impaired. The pro-inflammatory cytokines keep firing, the damping signal weakens, and the body enters a state called chronic low-grade inflammation, persistent low-level immune activation that never resolves. It does not hurt in the way an acute injury hurts. It does not announce itself. It operates quietly the way rust operates on iron, and over years it does exactly what rust does. It degrades structure from the inside. Chronic low-grade inflammation is now understood to be a contributing mechanism in cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline, accelerated cellular aging, and metabolic dysfunction. This is documented across decades of peer-reviewed research. It is not a fringe theory. It is physiology. Now, here's the first thing I want to address, and it will likely surprise you. The first factor I want to discuss is not sugar, not processed food, not sedentary behavior. Those matter, and we will address them. But the most overlooked inflammatory intervention available to most people sits in a coffee cup. And for years, the guidance from conventional medicine has been cautious at best, dismissive at worst. Coffee has been getting a poor reputation it does not deserve. And the reason that reputation formed has nothing to do with the biochemistry of the drink and everything to do with the fact that it was studied primarily in the context of cardiovascular risk decades ago before researchers had adequate tools to isolate individual bioactive compounds. The picture has changed substantially. What has not changed is the guidance most people still carry from their last appointment. Now let's get into the specific mechanisms, the reasons why two of the most ordinary substances in the world are in fact among the most well-documented dietary anti-inflammatory compounds available. And I want to start with coffee. I know what you are thinking. Coffee is caffeine? Caffeine is a stimulant. What does a stimulant have to do with inflammation? I am going to explain that, and I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Coffee is not one substance. It is a complex mixture of bioactive compounds, of which caffeine is only one and not the most important one for the mechanisms we are discussing. The compound I want to focus on is called chlorogenic acid. Chlorogenic acid is a polyphenol. Polyphenols are plant-based compounds that interact with biological processes in the human body in ways that are now extensively documented in clinical research. Chlorogenic acid does several things simultaneously subconsciously inside you when you drink a cup of coffee. First, it acts directly on inflammatory signaling pathways. Research published in peer-reviewed journals over the last decade has documented that chlorogenic acid inhibits the activation of NF-κB, nuclear factor kappa B, which is a master regulator of the inflammatory response. NF-κB is the switch that tells the body to produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. Chlorogenic acid, at concentrations achievable through ordinary coffee consumption, measurably damps that switch. This is not a small finding. NF-κB dysregulation is implicated in virtually every chronic inflammatory condition studied in modern medicine, and there is a common denominator in your kitchen that addresses it. Second, chlorogenic acid has documented effects on blood vessel function. It supports the production of nitric oxide, a molecule that regulates the diameter and flexibility of blood vessels. Vessels that maintain their flexibility are better able to respond to changes in blood pressure, better able to deliver oxygen and nutrients to tissues, and less prone to the endothelial dysfunction, impairment of the inner vessel lining that precedes cardiovascular disease. Stiff vessels are inflamed vessels, and chlorogenic acid supports the opposite. Third, chlorogenic acid influences glucose metabolism, how your body handles blood sugar in the hours after a meal. Sustained blood sugar spikes drive inflammation. They generate a cascade of metabolic stress that directly activates pro-inflammatory pathways. Chlorogenic acid has been shown in clinical research to slow glucose absorption from food in the gut and to improve insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissues. The mechanism is direct. Less blood sugar disruption means less metabolic inflammatory signaling. Drink the coffee, slow the cascade. I am not saying this to suggest that coffee cures disease. I am saying it because once you understand what is actually in your cup and what it does, the irrational guilt dissolves, and you can use what you already have with knowledge and precision rather than anxiety. Here is the genuinely good news. 2 to 3 cups per day is the range where the evidence on anti-inflammatory benefit is most consistently observed. In large population studies, not 10 cups, not an espresso the size of a bucket, 2 to 3 cups made simply without additives that undo the benefit, and we will address what undermines the benefit in the protocol section. Now, the second mechanism, and this one is perhaps even more important than what we just covered, almost nobody in a clinical setting will connect oats to wound healing, to tissue repair, to systemic inflammation resolution. But the connection is direct, documented, and clinically verified at the cellular level. Oats contain 2 categories of bioactive compounds that are relevant to this discussion. The first is called avenanthramides. Avenanthramides are a class of polyphenol found almost exclusively in oats. They are not found in other commonly eaten grains at meaningful concentrations. Their primary documented action is inhibition of inflammatory signaling in blood vessel walls. They directly reduce the expression of adhesion molecules, proteins on the surface of vessel lining cells that act as docking stations for white blood cells. Fewer adhesion molecules means less immune cell accumulation in vessel walls. Less accumulation means less inflammatory damage to the vessel itself. This is the mechanism underlying oat consumption's documented association with cardiovascular health. And it has nothing to do with fiber, which is the explanation most people have heard. The second compound is beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a soluble fiber, yes, but it functions as something considerably more specific than just roughage. Beta-glucan is what is called an immunomodulator, a compound that regulates immune system activity rather than simply stimulating or suppressing it. It binds to specific receptors on macrophages. Macrophages are the large immune cells that function as the primary responders to tissue damage and infection. When beta-glucan binds those receptors, it alters the behavior of those macrophages in a way that has now been documented in medical research. It promotes an anti-inflammatory, pro-healing phenotype rather than the aggressive pro-inflammatory phenotype that drives chronic damage. Research conducted using extracted oat bioactives in wound healing models, standard scientific models used to evaluate tissue repair, documented something remarkable. The rate of healing doubled, not improved modestly, doubled. And the tissue that healed showed a different quality than tissue that healed without oat bioactive support. The inflammatory markers in the healed tissue were substantially suppressed, new blood vessel growth into the repaired tissue was accelerated, and this finding was unexpected even to the researchers. The scarring that normally follows tissue repair was significantly reduced. Scarless or near scarless healing is considered a target in surgical and pharmaceutical research, precisely because it is so difficult to achieve. And oat bioactives produce it in a laboratory model. I am not saying that eating oatmeal oatmeal will heal your wounds without scarring. I am saying that the biology underlying those findings operates inside your body when you eat real oats regularly. The reduction in inflammatory signaling, the support for blood vessel repair, the macrophage modulation, those mechanisms are active whether you're healing a cut or managing the low-grade systemic inflammation that is quietly degrading your metabolic health year by year. That is the mechanism. That is what you are harnessing. The third factor, one that influences both the inflammatory response and your body's ability to benefit from these compounds, is something that most people recognize in theory but underestimate in practice. Caloric overload, not occasional overeating, habitual caloric excess at every meal. Here is the mechanism. When caloric intake consistently exceeds the body's immediate energy requirements, the excess is stored as adipose tissue, body fat, particularly visceral fat, the fat deposited around the internal organs. Visceral fat is not inert storage. It is metabolically active tissue. It releases its own cytokines, called adipokines, and a disproportionate share of those adipokines are pro-inflammatory. Visceral fat is essentially an inflammatory signaling organ sitting inside your abdominal cavity. The more of it you carry, the louder the chronic inflammatory noise in your system. This is why reducing caloric intake matters for inflammation, independent of any specific dietary change. Population groups with documented longevity and low rates of chronic inflammatory disease share one consistent characteristic that predates discussion of any specific food. They do not overeat. They eat to a point of moderate satiation and stop. Every anti-inflammatory food you eat is operating against a background inflammatory signal. Reduce that background signal by not overeating, and every other intervention you implement becomes more effective. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because once you understand the cost of habitual caloric excess on your inflammatory baseline, the motivation to moderate intake becomes very concrete. And here is the genuinely good news, not the marketing kind. Visceral fat responds faster to caloric moderation than almost any other tissue. Clinical research consistently shows that even modest reductions in habitual caloric intake, sustained over weeks rather than months, produce measurable reductions in circulating inflammatory markers. This is a 4-part daily approach, no supplements, no specialized equipment, no expensive ingredients. Everything you need is either already in your home or available at any ordinary grocery store for ordinary cost. Part 1, morning coffee, done correctly. 2 cups is the target range. 3 is acceptable. 1 is enough if that is your preference. The anti-inflammatory benefit does not require large volume. It requires consistency and the absence of what undermines it. What undermines it is added sugar and ultra-processed creamers. Sugar directly activates the same inflammatory pathways that chlorogenic acid works to downregulate. You cannot fight inflammation from one end of the cup while feeding it from the other. Black coffee, or coffee with a small amount of full-fat dairy, milk or cream, is appropriate. Full-fat dairy does not activate the same inflammatory response that added sugar does. And the fat in full-fat dairy actually improves the absorption of fat-soluble compounds in coffee. If you prefer to add something sweet, a small amount of raw honey, no more than 1 teaspoon, is a reasonable choice that does not carry the same inflammatory signaling burden as refined sugar. Drink your coffee in the morning before or with a light meal. The chlorogenic acid exerts its most documented effect on blood sugar regulation when consumed around mealtimes. Part 2, whole oats. 5 days per week minimum, not instant oats, not flavored oat packets, whole rolled oats or steel cut oats. The processing that produces instant oats significantly reduces the concentration of eventhamides, the polyphenol fraction that drives the anti-inflammatory benefit. This is not a minor distinction. A study comparing the bioavailability of avenanthramides from whole oats versus highly processed instant oats found meaningful differences in the concentration of active compounds reaching systemic circulation. Rolled oats take 5 minutes. Steel cut take longer but can be made the night before and reheated. Cook them in water, add full-fat plain yogurt, and a small amount of fruit after cooking. Do not add sugar or flavored syrups. The yogurt serves a second purpose beyond palatability. The fermented bacteria in live culture yogurt support the gut microbiome, and gut microbiome diversity is directly connected to the regulation of systemic inflammation. 1 portion is roughly 60 to 80 grams dry weight. That is 1 generous cup before cooking. Do not reduce the portion. Beta-glucan benefit is dose-dependent within a normal consumption range. Part 3, caloric moderation at the evening meal. This is the most important meal to address because it is the meal with the highest potential for caloric overload in most people's daily pattern, and the one consumed closest to sleep, the period when the body does most of its cellular repair work. A large caloric load in the evening requires extensive metabolic processing precisely when the body's biological priority is repair and recovery. The practical approach, make your evening meal the smallest of the 3 main meals. Prioritize protein and vegetables. Reduce or eliminate refined carbohydrates at dinner specifically. Do not eat within 2 hours of sleeping. This is not a rigid rule for everyone. Individual variation exists, but 2 hours between the end of eating and the intended sleep time is a reasonable baseline supported by documented data on metabolic function and overnight inflammatory marker profiles. Part 4, eliminate ultra-processed food from the daily pattern. This does not mean eliminating all convenience or all preparation shortcuts. It means understanding the distinction between food that has been cooked and prepared from real ingredients, even if those ingredients come from a package, and food that has been manufactured in an industrial facility with the addition of emulsifiers, artificial flavoring agents, added sugar, preservatives, and chemical compounds that do not occur in any natural food source. That second category is what you are removing. Not because it is philosophically impure, because the emulsifiers found in ultra-processed foods have been documented to disrupt the intestinal lining, increasing gut permeability. Often described as leaky gut, which means the tight junctions between intestinal cells loosen, allowing partially digested molecules and bacterial fragments into the bloodstream, where the immune system treats them as foreign invaders and mounts an inflammatory response. Every day you eat ultra-processed food, you are providing a low-grade immune activation signal. Remove the signal, and the immune system has the opportunity to downregulate. These 4 parts work as a system. Within 4 to 6 weeks of consistent application, most people will notice measurable changes in energy, in inflammatory markers if they track blood work, and in digestive function. Not because anything magical is happening, because the systemic inflammatory background noise has been addressed from multiple angles simultaneously. That is physiology, not magic. Here is the week-by-week plan. Week 1, preparation. This week, you are not overhauling anything. You are observing and making 2 changes only. First, make your coffee correctly every morning for 7 days. That means black or with full-fat dairy, no added sugar. If you currently add sugar to your coffee, reduce it by half this week and to 0 by the end of week 1. Second, remove 1 ultra-processed item from your regular daily pattern, the one you eat most frequently. 1 item. That is the entire week 1 instruction. No external changes will be visible yet. Internally, the process has already started. Your gut microbiome begins shifting within days of dietary change. Your cytokine signaling profile begins adjusting within 72 hours of removing consistent inflammatory inputs. Week 2, activation. Add the oatmeal protocol every weekday morning. Rolled or steel-cut oats, 60 to 80 grams, dry cooked in water, topped with plain full-fat yogurt and a small amount of fruit. No added sugar. Continue the corrected coffee protocol. Begin implementing the evening meal modification. Reduce refined carbohydrates at dinner. Reduce overall portion size at the evening meal. And observe the 2-hour rule between eating and sleep. Week 3, observation. By now, you have been running this protocol for 2 weeks. Pay attention to the following: your energy level in the late morning after the coffee and oats combination, your digestive comfort, particularly in the hours after dinner, your sleep quality, specifically whether you wake during the night, which is often connected to late evening metabolic load. These are not dramatic transformations. They are signals from your biology telling you the system is responding. Look for them deliberately. Week 4 and beyond. Consolidation. Within 30 days of consistent adherence, research on dietary inflammatory interventions consistently shows measurable reductions in CRP, C-reactive protein, which is a blood marker of systemic inflammation. Not only reduced inflammatory markers, but also improved metabolic function, better glucose regulation, and in many cases a spontaneous reduction in appetite that makes caloric moderation effortless rather than disciplined. Because you have not been masking a symptom, you have been supporting the entire organism from the inside. Here is something worth noting before we move to the final section. The anti-inflammatory effect of both coffee and oats changes with age. After 50, the gut's ability to absorb enanthromides from oats decreases as intestinal transit slows and microbiome diversity typically declines. After 65, metabolic response to chlorogenic acid shifts. The glucose regulation benefit becomes more pronounced, but so does the risk of masking early-stage metabolic issues with dietary intervention alone. How old are you? Write it in the comments. I want to understand the age profile of this audience so I can build future content calibrated precisely to your risk profile and your physiology. That number genuinely affects the recommendations I prioritize next. Here is the complete picture. 3 factors drive chronic systemic inflammation, persistent pro-inflammatory cytokine signaling, gut permeability from ultra-processed food exposure, and the background inflammatory output of excess visceral fat from habitual caloric overload. You now have concrete tools for each: coffee with chlorogenic acid, 2 to 3 cups per day, no added sugar consistently, evananthromides, and beta-glucan from whole oats, 60 to 80 grams, 5 days per week minimum, not instant packets. Caloric moderation at the evening meal. Smallest meal of the day, no refined carbohydrates at dinner. 2 hours before sleep. Elimination of one ultra-processed daily item per week until the daily pattern is primarily real, prepared food. These 4 steps work as a system. The anti-inflammatory compounds in coffee and oats operate most effectively when the background inflammatory signal from ultra-processed food and caloric overload has been reduced. Reduce the noise. Then amplify the signal. The cost is negligible. The ingredients are already in most kitchens. The mechanism is physiological reality, documented in peer-reviewed research, and it does not require a prescription. One clinical note before we close. If you experience significant digestive discomfort, bloating, or altered bowel patterns when introducing whole oats, particularly if those symptoms persist beyond 2 weeks, that warrants an evaluation. A small percentage of individuals have sensitivities to components in oats that require clinical assessment rather than dietary self-management. If you have documented kidney disease or are on medications that interact with dietary changes in potassium or phosphorus, discuss any significant dietary modification with the clinician managing your condition before implementing this protocol. If you have a history of cardiac arrhythmia and notice any change in rhythm or palpitations associated with increased coffee intake, that is a reason for clinical evaluation, not something to manage at home. Everything discussed today supports your body's own regulatory function. It does not replace medical evaluation when something needs to be clinically examined. The best intervention is the one that turned out to be unnecessary. Nobody in a white coat is going to walk you through this at an appointment. There is no billing code for a conversation about chlorogenic acid in coffee or evanthramides in oats. There is no revenue in telling you that what you need may already be sitting in your kitchen. The system generates income from return visits, from investigations, from prescriptions. That is a fact of the system, not a criticism of the individuals working within it. The individuals are doing their jobs under time pressure and within a structure that was not designed to prioritize this kind of conversation. I have spent many years in clinical practice watching what happens when people are given the wrong answer to the right question and watching what changes when they finally get the right one. Help us reach 100,000 subscribers. Subscribe, hit like, and help build something that actually serves you. Your health is not a profit center here. It is the whole point